there are two things I talked about from a leadership perspective. I think one was this whole concept of modernizing your storytelling. And I think that is just fundamental to who I am as a leader and how I operate as an educator as well. And especially when I'm sitting in an advisor seat to senior C-suite leaders. Um, I think what's really critical is that you can just sit down and say, well, I've done things this way and I'm not going to change, right? So let's like give you a tactical example. We all grew up writing press releases. Many of you are probably still doing that. I think the relevance of the press release suddenly became a lot more important because of the LLMs and how they are now scouting information, and how discovery of information is happening right now. But I remember very early in my career, I used to say PR is so much more than writing a press release, right? That's the first association that most business leaders will have with communications, or when they might come up to you and say, well, why don't you just pick up the phone and call this reporter and let's see if we can get this headline. For anyone who's been in comms and PR for a long time, you know that's not how it works, right? It's years of investing into those relationships. It's a lot of education that happens behind the scenes. There's a very strategic, very intentional focus behind how we communicate, what we communicate, when we communicate as well. So I think if you are pushing yourself to really continue to modernize how you think about communications as a whole, I think is going to be really, really critical. And that's where, measurement comes in. That's where you raise the stake, not just for the work that you do as an individual, but for your own entire organization. And when your peers and your partners and your collaborators within the organization see the impact that you can create as a function as a whole, that's when you'll start seeing investments both in terms of budget for technology, for people, operational needs, but you have to show the value. And I think you have to do that consistently as well. The other, I think, thing that I talked a little bit about was this concept of being a business leader. And I think it's really critical to just take a step back and really, really understand how the business runs, and making sure you're doing your due diligence in finding those moments to educate yourself. So being a life learner is, I think, just really, really critical. Be curious, but always be curious with a purpose, because I think that's going to allow you to grow in spaces and, really get a little bit uncomfortable with some of the areas as well. We touched upon AI, and I think Melissa had asked me to share a little bit of my own perspective on AI. I think way back in the day, social media was a buzzword, and I think AI, in my mind, is not just a buzzword. I think it's a reality that's in front of us. I look at AI as a couple of things. One, I think it's an amplifier for a strong comm strategy. So if you're not applying that today, you absolutely should. I think it allows our function to become more proactive than just being a reactive function. We've seen a lot of its impact and stories around, efficiency, whether it comes to monitoring, synthesizing data, reporting it back. I think where AI is going to be really critical is this reshaping content and discovery. And I think that's where it's going to play a really cool role. And if you know anything about our traditional marketing funnel, I think it's collapsed that funnel in a big way. Reputation, education, conversion is increasingly happening all in the same place. You don't need to have different touch points. So how do you, as a communications leader, as a strategic leader, really invest in that and figure out, what's the role it has to play in the trust and the business outcome space, because that's really where we play in as well. So let me just pause on that because I think it was a lot of information, but let me see if there are any questions from the group.
I will say that one question just appeared in the chat. I'll read it for you. With AI
Sure.
becoming such a big part of communications, how can leaders use it without losing their voice or sounding less authentic?
Yeah, so great question. Thank you. Thank you for asking that. I would say, I think even with the incoming of the AI, I think what you all have to remember is that we are still more intelligent than AI itself, right? AI, the way it works is it's really around the data sets that you provide. And I don't think AI is at a point where it can think on its own just the way humans do. So I would say, I think the way you want to think about transparency and the way you want to think about being authentic to your voice is There's been a lot of talk about how to use AI. We haven't spent as much time on the ethics and the governance of AI, and I think that's where it really comes down to. I use the LLMs quite a bit. I use that for my first drafts. I use that for a lot of back and forth. I use that for a lot of interview preps as well. But I think where you have to be really thoughtful and careful about is don't just take something that's an output and take that and place that, right? You almost have to go back and do some more due diligence into the facts and the information that's coming through and being thoughtful about it. Think of AI as output is really dependent on what the input is. And I think what you're sharing, if you're giving them a biased, opinionated ask, they're probably going to give you an output that's going to be based on it. So I think our role actually becomes even more critical in making sure the outputs that we're getting out of it stays consistent with our voice and the transparency that we want to create.
We are coming up to 1:30, and I also had a question, but I don't want to steal the time if anybody else wants to jump in with 1 minute to go. Last call, I'm checking for hands raised, people coming off mute or video. All right, I'm very selfishly going to ask this question. So you've obviously been through a lot of mergers and technology changes, and I'm curious to know how, with data being able to be interpreted in different ways, and right now the big thing is AI a threat to jobs or is AI a benefit to jobs, and how different groups are interpreting that and spreading that. How do you use that data responsibly to be able to share that, whatever the new technology might be, to get stakeholders, whether they're internal or external, to buy in and try and really listen to you as the communicator and the expert? Like, how do you do that?
Yeah, I would say data is only as good as the story that you tell around it. I mean, I'll give you a great example. This morning, I was looking at a spreadsheet of numbers. It didn't tell me anything, right? It was a beautiful spreadsheet, had all the right things. It had no benchmarks. It had no insights. I didn't know if we were actually doing better or not. So I think it's almost like taking a base step back and thinking, when you think about data, you really think about not just the numbers in front of you, but how you're going to interpret that and what are the insights, right? It's the insights that actually drive the business forward. It's not just the numbers itself. So, for example, Melissa, if let's say one of the data, I mean, I've been telling a lot of my students is share of voice is a very popular KPI within strategic PR and comms. I think it needs to move to share of answer, especially if you're really rethinking your strategy around LLMs, right? If your brand is not showing up in searches, then you're doing something wrong. But in order to be able to measure the impact of that, you really need to start thinking about what's your story, where you're showing up, how are you showing up, and does it really alter your KPI as part of that too? So I think, again, it's always really critical to go back and look at the accuracy and the sourcing of the data, but then really having the ability to take the data and then interpret in the right way, and then figure out where those insights are going to be useful. Can you spot trends? Right? Trends are always really critical. Can you do benchmarking? Because that allows you to, can you do more A/B testing? Like, one of the cool things about AI is that the testing is so much easier and less time consuming than how it used to be back in the day, especially for digital creatives. And I think that's going to be a game changer in how quickly we can adapt to certain things and make those shifts as well.